Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. This week we are chatting with filmmaker and cryptid researcher Aleksandar Petakov. Aleksandar has traveled the U.S. and the world researching various cryptids, including Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, and other phenomena, including UFOs. He is also a crew member for the Small Town Monsters films and produces his own YouTube series, Sasquatch Out of the Shadows and Small Town Monsters Beyond the Trail. You can find more information about Aleksandar on his website, petakovmedia.com, and I'll put all the links in the show notes as usual. Hey, Aleksandar, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
Not a problem. I do a lot of ghost stuff, but I love to throw cryptids in there with the whole umbrella of the paranormal and get stories from that too, just to do something a little different every once in a while.
Yeah, definitely. I'm not huge on the ghost stuff myself, or really the UFO stuff. I've had some weird experiences in both realms, but it's just not something I usually look into. But a lot of times at these events, paranormal kind of type events, you end up meeting a lot of people that are into those things. So it's cool to see how passionate people are about those topics, because I obviously feel the same about the things I'm into. So I can appreciate the enthusiasm and the effort that goes into it.
Yeah, I've been a paranormal researcher investigator for 25 years, and so my forte's always been ghost, but you always get the crossover, in different cases.
Sure.
And also the more I do it, the more I find out that it's all connected in some way, is what it seems.
Yeah, there's some weird overlap. I mean, I'm more of a kind of boots on the ground kind of guy. I like getting out into the woods. I fancy myself as an outdoorsman. Spend a lot of time hiking and backpacking throughout some of the wildest areas in North America. And it's beautiful seeing some of these spots, but you get to certain places that there seems to be more of a connection between things like Bigfoot and UFOs and ghosts. And, not necessarily saying they're directly connected, but in the sense that these things are going on in the same place. Basically, it's usually smaller areas. I know there's the modern term sort of a window area or a flap area. Bridgewater Triangle, case in point, is one in Massachusetts that I've looked into over the years quite a bit. Having interest in the Bigfoot topic, there's a lot of very interesting Bigfoot stories, but you can't really talk about an area like the Bridgewater Triangle without mentioning puckwudgies or ghosts, hauntings, King Philip's War, a lot of the other strange things that place is known for, alleged satanic cult activity, grisly murders. It's all this sort of stuff wrapped up in one. And for whatever reason, it's manifested itself either culturally or psychologically on people as the Bridgewater Triangle. And that happens in other places. I mean, there's other triangles as well. There's places like this place in Pennsylvania I've investigated in the past, in central Pennsylvania, where we saw what I could only describe a UFO by definition of the word, unidentified flying object, and that's an area that's heavy with Bigfoot sightings as well as strange orbs. People see black unmarked helicopters. So there's a lot of weirdness in certain areas, and you start seeing that over time. And, like I said, whether or not that means that Bigfoot is an alien or is connected with UFOs, that's not what I'm implying, but it's just interesting to see that people are reporting a lot of these sorts of things in the same areas often, which I find pretty intriguing.
Yeah, and those are fighting words to some people in the Bigfoot community. You try to cross the two with aliens, and Bigfoot, and people want to fight you over it.
Right, yeah, there's a lot of division, obviously. I lean personally more towards the flesh and blood camp for Bigfoot, that it is some sort of an unknown. At this point, I'm leaning more towards relic hominid, something that's a lot closer to humans than previously thought, with theories like the Giganopithecus. And that's simply because there's so much space still in North America. I think a lot of people don't understand, despite, our, treatment of the wilderness and how we've spread to every corner of this continent, there is still some places that are so wild and inaccessible that it's almost ridiculous to assume that there couldn't be something hiding there. I mean, we were just recently in Alaska for about 3 weeks, and, we were going to some seriously off-grid places. I mean, places that you cannot get to without a boat or a plane. And if there's bad weather, you can forget about getting in there at all. And that's where some of these reports are coming from. So, I mean, there are weirder aspects, and, I don't discount the possibility that maybe there's something weirder going on. I don't know, but at least from what I've come across, majority of eyewitness sightings of something like Bigfoot or Sasquatch tend to be heavily skewed, at least 75% or more. They don't report anything other than seeing an unknown hairy bipedal creature that's engaging in some sort of behavior, running away, throwing rocks, doing something along those lines. But there are those reports that do report orbs and other weird things associated with it. And in the past, I think researchers have been sort of discounting a lot of that. But I don't discount it. Just because it doesn't fit my worldview doesn't mean I'm going to toss it out wholeheartedly and just say let's cherry pick the data. It's there. The stories are there, and I've met trustworthy people who have very strange things. They've seen a Bigfoot, but they've also seen other weird things in association with it. So I'm not here to tell them what they did or didn't see. I'm just here to collect the story, share their story, and maybe there's something we can learn from it. And I think more researchers should look at it sort of that way. But again, like you said, it's fighting words for a lot of folks. They think it has to be one way or the other.
Yeah, and to your point of there's all these expanses of forest. I think like the Olympic Peninsula out on the west coast of the United States is like 69,000 square miles of just forest. So if you just have a sprinkling of these, because I very much believe, like you were saying, in the flesh and blood, leftover hominid type of ape creature as Bigfoot. But when you got these big expansive forests and you just have a small population, then people want to chime up and say, well, why you found a body and all this type of stuff? Well, go try to find a bear carcass out in the Olympic Peninsula. You're going to be hard pressed to find any remnants.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's a good point. The Olympic Peninsula, and we went there last April. What an amazing place. I mean, it's one of the most, the Pacific Northwest, and there's certain areas in North America that just seem like they're a better habitat for something that wants to stay hidden, something that relies on its environment, because it's that temperate rainforest, especially the Olympic Peninsula, but all up and down the Pacific Northwest. And if you look at, in general, some of the sightings across the continent, they tend to line up with areas that have a lot more precipitation than drier, more arid environments like the Southwest, where it's a little bit desert, high desert, even the Midwest, where you have, not a lot of tree cover. The sightings tend to cluster in the Pacific Northwest, in the Canadian provinces of Alberta and British Columbia up into Alaska, like some of the areas we're in. And then on the East Coast, you have down in, or at least in the South, you have the swamps down into Texas, Louisiana, all the way down to Florida, the Everglades, then up and down the Appalachian Mountains, which span from Georgia to Maine. And that's some of the most rugged mountains in the eastern United States. And that's where a lot of the forest is. And those sightings tend to kind of line up with that, which is very interesting. There aren't people seeing it in cornfields in Iowa as much as they see them in the North Georgia or the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. So it's pretty interesting how it lines up like that. But an area like the Olympic Peninsula absolutely is just probably some of the best habitat. That whole temperate rainforest, and I've witnessed this time and time again being in, from Washington to Alaska, basically all that habitat in between is you have this temperate rainforest environment that never gets too hot, never gets too cold. It's always a little damp. There's an abundance of wildlife. You've got elk and deer and mountain lions, black bears, grizzly bears in some areas, or brown bears as they call them. And there's just so many food sources on land, but then you have the ocean right there where you have tons of food sources, fish, of course, salmon, places like the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, clams, mussels, shoots of seaweed that can grow 10 feet long that you could easily consume. As we know, people eat seaweed. So there's so many food sources on and off land. I think that sort of stretch from Northern California to Southeast Alaska into the Kenai Peninsula is probably some of the best habitat for something like a Sasquatch in the world. And it's no surprise that that's where a lot of the incredible sightings come from, and a lot of sightings in general. And there's a long history of flora, such as the Southeast Alaska and British Columbia and the coastal Salish peoples of what the Sasquatch, that's what the anglicized term was for it. So it's really no surprise that area has a very long history. It just makes sense.
Yeah. And the fact that there is such a history with the indigenous people and the indigenous populations of Canada and the United States and kind of all around the world, with, the Yeti and these other places that have different terms. And it just seems to me like, even though we don't have a body yet, there's still plenty of evidence out there that there's some sort of creature.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing when it comes to, a body or fossils, and a lot of the environments in North America where you think of where fossils come from, places like Utah, South Dakota, elsewhere, those environments are not obviously now conducive very much for living, right? They're deserts, whereas millions, maybe thousands of years ago, they were lush forests or more inhabitable for a large variety of species. That's where you have a lot of the mastodon, a lot of the ice age creatures, dinosaur bones that have been discovered. Whereas, if you look at these areas as I mentioned, like temperate rainforests and all up and down the Appalachians, and in general, the wooded areas of North America are not very conducive for fossilization. You rarely get fossils. And if you look at other great apes, such as gorillas, chimps, and orangutans, gorillas and chimps are virtually non-existent on the fossil record because they've lived for millions of years in environments that are rainforests and jungles in Africa. So that those areas are not conducive for producing fossils. I mean, and the orangutan as well in Indonesia and Sumatra, where you have stories of another bipedal, smaller kind of Bigfoot-like creature called the orang pendek, and you have a long history of native folklore there as well as Dutch colonization. Even to the modern era, people reporting sightings, and then you have the discovery of the Homo floresiensis that was found in these caves in terms of fossil evidence, and believed to have lived side by side by Homo sapiens at one point. And there was even a recent article published where some scientists proposed, well, this creature may still be alive, in certain areas, because based on the folklore and the sort of stories from the natives in that area. And I think the Giganopithecus story, which is what a lot of people at one point thought might be something Sasquatch. Sasquatch could be the Giganopithecus. And for folks that don't know, the Giganopithecus was the largest primate to live in history. Essentially, it was at this point, we believe it was something orangutan-like. So basically a giant orangutan that lived in parts of Southeast Asia. And the only fossil evidence we have for this giant primate are a few thousand teeth and parts of a jawbone. There's literally nothing else that exists that this thing was a real animal aside from that. And those were discovered in Chinese apothecary shops in the 1930s and 40s when the Chinese would collect these, what they call dragon bones, and use them for their traditional medicine. Well, that's where a lot of fossil discoveries were made. And the only reason those bones were even preserved were because porcupines would eat the rest of the bones. And, if these creatures happened to die in a cave or bits and pieces were dragged into the cave by the porcupines, the molars were small enough that they wouldn't get consumed, or they would just sort of fall on the wayside and thus perfectly preserved. Because, again, those creatures lived in environments that were very rainforest-like and jungle-like in parts of China and Southeast Asia. So those also weren't conducive for preserving fossils. So primates are not the greatest for fossil preservation. I mean, a lot of the stuff we have from Africa, those environments that are now where those bones are being discovered are very arid and dry, whereas at the time these creatures would have lived, they were likely much more lush and much more conducive for all sorts of life, which is why I think those primates went to those areas in the first place. So when it comes to Sasquatch, there is a strong case for fossils not being discovered in the body, not being discovered simply because of the environment that these things exist in or seem to exist in.
Yeah, and talking about the fossil record, you have other animals like the coelacanths and things like that they thought were extinct, and still other animals that are on the extinct list that are being rediscovered. And you got people like Forrest Galante out there looking for these animals and rediscovering them because they are in such remote places. And they pop back up, and people still report like the Tasmanian tiger, even though it's supposedly been extinct since the early 1900s. But you still have people out there that see it because the area is so uninhabited that you can still have small populations of these animals living. And just because we don't see them all the time doesn't mean they don't exist.
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of that, and I like Forrest Galante's work and his show, and obviously a little less cryptid focused. But I mean, you can include some of these creatures perhaps in cryptozoology as well. Essentially, the study of hidden or unknown animals, and something I focused on quite a bit here in the eastern United States is the mountain lion sort of a topic that's been going around for a while, and alleged sightings of mountain lions up and down the East Coast for a number of years, and they've officially been extinct in this area since at least the late 1800s, early 1900s. That's so the story goes. But there is evidence that cats from out west are moving eastward, sort of filling a niche here and unlimited food sources. And there's a lot of credible sightings, and there's been DNA found, and it's a very interesting topic unto itself. But again, it's a known animal that used to inhabit an area that's simply kind of returning to its former range, albeit slowly. Or some people believe maybe there were pockets of these creatures that managed to survive in some of the deeper and darker kind of mountainous areas on the East Coast that weren't hunted off. Because humans, we have to understand, a lot of the world at this point, our impact is so strong in terms of simply what we've been able to do. We are the most widespread creature basically in the world. We can inhabit almost any environment. So we've gone into so many different environments, whether it be desert or forest or rainforest or you name it, and sort of model it to fit us, right? And we've done a lot of things to change the environment, whether it be like in Florida in the Everglades, draining parts of the Everglades, which causes ecological disaster and changing an environment that's been fine-tuned for millions of years. We do these sorts of things, and it creates an impact on the wildlife that lives in these areas. Oftentimes we kill threatening animals like grizzly bears or mountain lions or creatures that prey on our livestock. So that fundamentally changes those environments and those ecosystems. So you may have in the future, when there's more sort of a eco-friendly way of looking at it. I mean, in the past 20, 30 years, a good example is where I live here in New England. We've had New England was clear-cut almost entirely multiple times in the past few hundred years. And in the past 100 years, the forests have bounced back. And with that, the return of large animals like moose and deer, black bear, all the other forest creatures have sort of returned. So it's not the original environment that it was. It creates a sort of a hybrid environment because it is sort of restoration, but it just goes to show how powerful nature is. Despite our sort of manufacturing and changing of the environment, it can still bounce back. So it's not entirely unrealistic for animals that once were thought to be extinct that could still be out there. And then you brought up thylacine as well, a Tasmanian tiger, which is a marsupial, sort of a dog-looking creature, but maybe there's parts of Tasmania and certain parts of Australia where they still could have survived despite our efforts to, basically destroy those environments. And now that there's more of a eco-friendly way of kind of administering and managing wild areas, it allows an opportunity for creatures to return. So I don't think that's entirely unrealistic. And I think we need to not only look at our impact on these environments, but the creatures that can then, thrive in an area that essentially has all the food sources and all the things that it need, but also our constant encroachment on those areas too. I mean, a lot of animals are adapting to living closer and closer to civilization. And so you have these run-ins with, bear and moose and other places that are going into suburban areas. And I mean, how many of us have raccoons and possums digging through our trash and that sort of thing? So, the wild can be right in your backyard in a lot of areas, especially as we push deeper in.
Yeah, yeah. And talking about the big cats, I live here in Tennessee, and the past 20 years, hunters have kind of gone back and forth with the Tennessee Wildlife Resource Agency because they want to say, the government wants to say, that they're not, mountain lions aren't here, they're not a threat, people don't need to be scared. Until you started having hunters here in the past couple of years actually catch them on trail cams. And so the TWRA actually had to come out and say, all right, well, we were wrong. Like, the mountain lions are actually back in Middle Tennessee, and they're repopulating.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm surprised. There's some moment of being able to say we're wrong from those associated with the government, and that's not a dig at the government. I think there's a bit of a conspiracy afoot in a lot of folks, and I've talked to so many people here in New England and other places on the East Coast who have a real sense of frustration with whether it be their local fish and game or Department of Natural Resources, whatever. Every state has a different sort of department that kind of looks at the wildlife and manages those wildlife. And I think the frustration is a lot of the times, there's sort of almost a denial type attitude. Oh, there's no way these animals could be here. We know about them, blah, blah, blah. And then there's been cases of mountain lions being found right under the noses of the authorities, such as the 2011 mountain lion allegedly from South Dakota, genetic makeup that made its way all the way to Connecticut and was virtually within an hour's reach of New York City. I mean, we're talking one of the most heavily populated areas of the United States, and this animal was struck by a car in that region. So it managed to get in there somehow. So you can only imagine states further north or further south that have a lot more forest cover where there's less of a chance of running into people. But I think it really comes down to the money and the management. Dealing with a mountain lion is entirely different than dealing with black bears or other predators that are found in some of these eastern states. So I think what's usually the case with government is, they sort of wait till the last minute to take care of an issue. And that's just me speculating. And I've met and talked with plenty of fish and game officials in my home state of New Hampshire and other places that they're kind of stuck in a limbo because, yes, there are credible sightings out there, but they can't just say, yes, these creatures are back without being able to do studies, and they have to be very kind of thorough with things. So think they get a little bit of a bad rep, especially some of those fish and game conservation guys. They're not, bad guys on the Illuminati payroll necessarily. I think it just has to do with budgets and everyone's scraping for every dollar. And, we all know how efficiently our governments in general run. So I think it just creates a distrust with the public. But I think the topic won't go away. I think at some point we will have more viable breeding population in the eastern United States, especially with the deer population. I mean, from West Virginia to Pennsylvania up into New England, you have such a vibrant population of deer. I mean, they're actually a nuisance in a lot of places. With hunting down, there's less people hunting in the woods than ever, becoming sort of a less popular sport. Unfortunately, that management is then, what do you do with that? Whereas if you had something that was like an apex predator, like a mountain lion, that might help keep the population in check. So there's a lot there. I mean, it becomes very complicated. And of course, it's, what do you do? But like I said, these animals, the sightings don't seem to be trending downward. There seems to be more and more. And yes, a lot of them may be misidentifications or people that are unfamiliar with other animals thinking they saw a mountain lion, but there are very credible sightings as well. So it's a very interesting topic.
And so talking to like Fish and Game and like park rangers and stuff, have you found they've had sightings of Bigfoot and their own experience with Bigfoot? How have they come across on that topic?
Yeah, it's interesting, because the mountain lion topic is a little bit more palatable, let's say, to society in general. I mean, I go to a lot of these events and I ask people about Bigfoot, and a lot of people, don't really take it seriously. But mountain lions, obviously mountain lions are a real animal that we know exists and that inhabited these areas, so it's less of a leap. So I'll get a lot of those stories, and sometimes, jokingly after talking to some of these wildlife officials, I'll sort of say, hey, well, you heard any Bigfoot stuff? And maybe I'll get an uneasy laugh, or, I'll just, it's kind of seen as a joke because I try to sort of kind of ease into it a little bit. And I've had a few instances where, a few of these guys have sort of taken a little bit more seriously, and they say, well, people do say they've seen stuff, but I haven't really got anything definitive from, people that I've personally spoken to. I've, of course, heard stories of, in other states of wildlife officials saying, hey, we keep a log of strange things that happen. U.S. Forest Service guys as well, rangers. A lot of the forests out west, especially, are run by the U.S. Forest Service. So that's a federal agency. That's not like a state park or fish and game that would be in a state-run capacity. These are federally administrated areas, and there's cases over the years. I mean, there's a famous encounter that happened in, I believe it was part of Idaho or Washington, I can't remember, but wildlife biologist Dr. John Mayanzinski, who worked for the Forest Service, they had heard a lot of these stories, and supposedly there were people keeping records and that sort of thing. So I think it depends. I think just where you go. Some places might embrace the idea of Bigfoot because it's maybe, I've seen that happen in places down south where certain state parks might embrace the idea of Bigfoot because it's kind of a fun thing for people to think about, and it maybe increases traffic to the park, or revenue, that kind of thing. Whereas other places I've seen it kind of treated more taboo. And then I've heard stories, as I said, of people actually keeping track, having log books of alleged sightings. And, I can only imagine being, let's say a Forest Service ranger or state park kind of worker. You hear so many of these stories over the years. I mean, what do you do with it? Do you just sort of sit on it and say, oh, all these people are crazy or they don't know what they're talking about? I would imagine myself, I would probably just, even if I didn't actively look into it, just, if you hear these stories constantly, just write them down, make a logbook. And then if somebody does come along as a researcher and ask, hey, have you heard any stories? You can say, well, I mean, here, you can take a peek at this. And, I don't know. I think it just really depends on where it is. But it's definitely something to kind of consider when visiting these sorts of places. You see a lot of tourism, like I said, embracing it now. You'll see even in places where 10 years ago there was nothing Bigfoot related, they'll sell Bigfoot stickers with the name of the state park or the national forest, and they'll have souvenirs kind of geared towards that because there's an interest in that topic. So I think, as it becomes more normalized, I hope that means we'll get to hear more about sightings that maybe have been kind of kept under wraps or sort of brushed to the side. Because ultimately, the more data we have to work with, the more we might be able to put patterns together, right? Because an individual sighting, while it may be interesting and compelling, it convinces the person they might believe that what they saw, but an individual sighting largely doesn't really help a lot with reported behavior and that sort of stuff. aside from maybe just what happened in that moment. But when you get, let's say, 20 sightings, then you're able to plot them on a map and say, well, there's an obvious pattern here. They're all happening near this river, or there's a certain type of behavior that's being reported more. Maybe there's more rock throwing associated with the certain region. So that's where eyewitness sightings kind of come into play. I think the more you have, and if they're deemed credible, that you can plot that. And there's some great people doing Bigfoot related data out there, like the Bigfoot Mapping Project and Squatchermetrics. So I think as time goes on and the subject gets more normalized, the more of that we get, the better off we'll be. And there are real world parallels to the crowd-sourced data to track animal populations. A good case in point is in the state of Florida, where their Department of Natural Resources, or whatever it is in Florida, I apologize. Like I said, so many states have different kind of acronyms. They basically keep track of mountain lions or the Florida panther, which is a sort of mountain lion offshoot in Florida, based off of eyewitness encounters. I mean, we had an encounter actually where we found a track in Florida while we were down there this past winter, and we reported it to the Florida Wildlife Commission, and they then plotted it on their website. And you can go on there and check it and see where people have found photos or seen the creatures. And that's what a lot of these sort of things like the Bigfoot Mapping Project are basically applying that same real world model, but to Bigfoot, which I think is really interesting and something that is overlooked.
Yeah, and talking about plotting the sightings and stuff with Bigfoot and things like that, why do you think that there are more sightings kind of on the West Coast? Because you're from New Hampshire, but there's definitely sightings on the East Coast too. I know of a lot in Tennessee, quite a few in Tennessee. But why do you think that is?
Well, I'm not sure. Speaking of the data, I don't really have it in front of me to confirm. There actually may be more overall sightings on the East Coast than the West Coast, believe it or not. And I could be totally wrong with that. It could be, very similar numbers. But I think if you just look at from, let's say Florida, Texas to Florida, and then Georgia to Maine, there are sightings in Canada, of course, but I think especially the Quebec province right above New England, which is massive. I mean, huge province, a lot of forest. There's a long history of sightings, but you don't hear many sightings out of there. I think that's primarily because of the language barrier, because it's primarily a French-speaking area. So in the past, English was not seen as a popular thing to speak there. So I've run into that looking at our neighbors to the north here, especially for me as a border state. But you look at those states, like I said, from the south to the north, that's a lot of territory. And I mean, those are areas where there's a lot of people. So it makes sense. Some of these more remote areas of the Pacific Northwest might have less sightings because you need people to see a Bigfoot. You need to have a person crossing the path with a Bigfoot. It was the right place, the right time for there to be an eyewitness sighting. So I think overall, like I said, if you look at from Alaska to Northern California, and then even the Rocky Mountains, you add those up, there's a lot of sightings. I don't know, which side comes out winning, east versus west. But what I mentioned earlier about that habitat being the best just is primarily due to the abundance of resources. I mean, there was also, places in the Appalachians that are just chock full of, as I mentioned, deer. And we're talking about the mountain lion topic, other wildlife, other resources. There are areas that have harsher winters, but some of those rainforest areas just seem to be year round. You wouldn't really have to move. You can stay in the same areas. You don't have to, let's say, seasonally migrate to an area lower or higher elevations. I mean, the Rocky Mountains, I've heard from a lot of folks out there say, well, in the summer times they go up to higher elevations because it's a little bit cooler. That's where the elk go. They sort of follow the food. Whereas in the winter time, they move a little bit lower where it's a little warmer. It's not as cold, not as snowy as it's some of those higher elevations. So when you're dealing with, those big peaks like that, some of those higher elevation areas, maybe that's what's going on in some of those spots. But like I said, I don't know necessarily who comes out on top. There was an attitude in the past where the West Coast was where all the real Bigfoot sightings were coming from, and anything east of the Rockies was basically, wishful thinking or misidentifications, which I think is just a ridiculous statement, especially if you look at the kind of consistency in sightings. I mean, I've talked to folks in New Hampshire, which is the second most forested state in the country. Not a huge state, but both Maine and New Hampshire here are the two most forested states. We just have the most amount of woods, and there's endless resources to support large animals like moose. Maine has the largest population of moose in the United States outside of Alaska. Almost 70,000 moose, plus or minus a few thousand. Those are huge animals that can weigh up to 1,200 pounds at their fullest. So these areas, even though they have harsh winters and all this sort of stuff support those animals and support upwards of 40,000 black bears. So, why wouldn't something else be able to use those same resources and exist? And the eyewitness sightings are there. I mean, I've talked to so many people, but the similarity of behaviors reported by people that have no connection to folks on the other side of the country, and they're reporting very similar behaviors in their descriptions of what they've seen or what they've experienced. That's when it really kind of gets your mind thinking, well, I mean, there's a consistency here that indicates some sort of a species. There may be some nuances, maybe regionally, or the descriptions down south, a little bit smaller, a little more lanky, and you wouldn't need to be as bulky in an area like North Florida where you have pretty mild weather year round and really hot in summer times. Whereas, a place like Maine, obviously there's a long winter, and you look at the black bear or deer, deer are smaller down in Florida, the bear are smaller in Florida, whereas up here in New England, they get big. In the winter, they puff out. These bears hibernate. The moose, are just bulkier. The deer are bulkier because of that extra winter weight. So when something like a Sasquatch maybe have similar attributes, that's something, we obviously a lot of this is speculation, but that's kind of where I sort of lean towards it, sort of making sense. But so there's just a lot of sightings in both of these areas, and I think you can't really go wrong. I mean, as long as you follow sort of imagine what something like this would need to live, a large amount of space. I mean, a small area surrounded by urban areas is probably not the best place for something like this to live. I mean, if you don't have other large animals that can thrive in an area, why would something like a Sasquatch be there? So there's a lot more habitat, I think, than people realize.
Yeah. And so through all your travels and all these places you've been and investigated for Sasquatch and cryptids, what kind of experiences have you ever had that kind of maybe, leans you more towards believing in some of this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. Obviously, personal experiences are pretty subjective. It's sort of, what did you take from the experience? I mean, I've had things that have happened that I can't explain, but I can't say 100% with Bigfoot, of course. I've never seen one, but, we've had things thrown at us. We've heard, the supposed wood knocks. You can explain away a certain number of them, but then there's others that are left and sort of kind of scratches your head. I mean, recently we were in Alaska and we spent a week out on a property where there's a long history of strange sightings and very remote, I mean, completely inaccessible unless you take a boat there, basically. A very, very dangerous kind of place because you have a lot of other dangerous wildlife, whether it be brown bears, black bear, moose, those sorts of things, critters that will absolutely kill you. And, you get hurt out there, you're basically done for. It's a long time before you can get back to anything even remotely civilized. So we spent some time out there, and there's a long history of weird stuff going on. And the property owner invited us out there, and we experienced hearing strange wood knocking sounds, hearing what sounded like rocks being thrown from a hill and hitting other rocks before landing into the water. Stuff stomping around outside our tent at night. Could that have been another animal? I mean, I suppose, but I don't know what animal could stomp and then smack a tree and just make very odd noises like that. But, of course, I can't 100% say Sasquatch related. We've had, like I said, experiences like that in other places, and not everything we've run into, of course, is a Sasquatch. I mean, that's usually very rarely that you run into anything that's possibly Sasquatch related. Most of the time, nothing happens. I mean, we try to go to these remote areas and these areas with a history of sightings and see what happens. And something does happen, we obviously share it with our audiences. And nothing happens, we'll tell you exactly what happened. We're not gonna, every noise we hear in the woods is not Bigfoot. There's just a handful of times where you hear strange things that just kind of make your mind go, well, I mean, what could that possibly be? Once you sort of begin the process of elimination. Okay, well, could this have been an elk? Could this have been a moose? And once you start deducing, and then you kind of end up, like finding a strange handprint. I mean, when you get to that point, there's really only a 50-50 there. It's either going to be a human being or something with a human-like hand that is larger and looks very strange, but that's not going to be a bear or something, especially when you're able to see it pretty clearly. So yeah, there's been I mean, I could go into specifics if you want anything else specific, but there's been a handful of times where we've really kind of been sort of left scratching our heads, as to what could this possibly be, other than what's being reported out there.
Yeah, the one thing that I found really interesting, like you were saying, that comes down to 50-50. It's either human or it has to be something humanoid, is the rock throwing. Because you think bears, elk, moose, nothing like that is going to be throwing rocks at you.
Yeah, that's the biggest one. I mean, last summer in the Green Mountains of Vermont, fellow researcher and I were camping in an area that I guess that I've come to learn has had a history of sightings. I didn't actually know it at the time. I was on my way to a Lake Champlain monster-related event on Lake Champlain, and we just happened to be passing through an area, and someone was like, "Oh, hey, if you need a place to camp, check out up here. It's a good spot." A friend of mine who had kind of been in that area before recommended it. So we just went up there and said, "Hey, we've got some time. Let's do some wood knocks. Let's put up a Sasquatch pheromone chip and just see what happens." And we were woken up by wood knocks that morning, and we had 7 to 8 different objects get thrown, basically landing right in front of our tent, and we could see it in an arch pattern as we sort of sat there paralyzed in the tent with the rain fly off, so we could see the leaves parting as these objects were flying and hitting the ground. And then immediately as it stopped, kind of immobilized and ran out, but realized it took us so long to get to the spot where possibly somebody could have been throwing stuff from, that it was just so thick. But it kind of left us wondering, what could that have been? I mean, was it a squirrel in the tree knocking things down? And we listened to the audio again. And it's just so ridiculous for it to have been a squirrel. Did it have large sticks that it was consistently knocking down in a pattern that sounded a lot heavier than acorns falling or anything like that? It just left us scratching our heads. Was it because we did do wood knocks and put up this pheromone chip type thing in the tree? Is that what provoked something? I don't know. I really have no clue. I mean, we've been back there to try to recreate the sounds, and the only thing that really even comes close is somebody physically going up that hill and throwing things towards where our tent was. That's the only thing that matches that sound from what I could ascertain. So that was a very odd one. Obviously, up, as I mentioned, Alaska, we'd be sitting around in a campfire away from this cabin and just sitting in the very large hill overlooking us. And, we'd hear wood knocks, and then again, we'd hear things being thrown. We wouldn't see them. We would hear, something hitting the rocks on the beach and then splashing into the water. And the only sound I could get to match it was physically taking a rock and throwing it at that same beach and having it bounce off a rock and fall into the water. And then, the following few nights we had sea lions in that cove. They make splashing noises and weird, kind of noises as they're doing their thing. I think it's mating season for them. So we had 20 so sea lions in that cove, and they were making these splashing noises. So we start second guessing ourselves. Well, okay, did we hear the sea lions last night splashing? Is that what was going on? But they hadn't moved in at that point, and there was no rock sound. You could clearly hear a rock hitting a rock before hitting the water. There was, with the sea lion splashes, it was just a splash, and you hear them swim away. Very different sound. So that you get stuck with that, and you sort of think, what? I mean, there's nothing else that can throw a rock, right? I mean,
Right.
Bears can. I suppose a bear or a deer could accidentally roll a rock off of a hill, but it has to be very steep, and that's a lot of the cases where the rock throwing has been reported. Especially in places like Florida, where there is almost no elevation at all. I mean, we're talking 3 feet of elevation. There's no way something can roll down that way. Stuff falling out of trees, maybe, but that property in particular in Alaska, there was a history of people actually seeing rocks flying in a horizontal pattern out of the woods into the water, and even being thrown into boats that are 100 feet out into the bay, being thrown from the woods into the boat, being discovered in there. There's nothing aside from, I mean, a person couldn't even do that, frankly. At that distance, you'd have to be, the best pitcher out there, and you maybe might get into the boats. That kind of precision, just absolutely ridiculous. So I don't know. I mean, and the chance of somebody being out there, especially in that place in Alaska, and pranking us and doing this kind of thing is just, people in Alaska don't mess around. People do not go out in the woods unarmed, because, like I mentioned, there's a lot of animals that can kill you. So that's a good way to really, put yourself in danger, and you wouldn't be able to survive in an area like that without some support system, and being able to trudge through these environments at night and sneak up on people in their camps. That just seems kind of preposterous to me. But yeah, it leaves you scratching your head, because it's not something I can 100% say, well, I physically saw a Bigfoot throw a rock, but it sort of it makes sense with the things that have been reported in some of these areas before. So, it's just one of those little tantalizing things that happen that kind of keeps your interest going. And we can only hope at one point that you hear a lot of these eyewitness sightings where, again, it was the person was in the right place at the right time, and they happened to be crossing the path of a Sasquatch, or the Sasquatch was curious, and that's where the encounter happened. All it takes is for us to be at the right place at the right time and have a good camera or the right equipment, and maybe come out with something that's compelling. That if you do believe in the Patterson-Gimlin film, that's essentially what those guys did. And there's obviously a lot of controversy about that. But if you use that model, then eventually, hopefully, we should have something comparable.
Yeah, and what is your opinion on like tree structures and nests that people claim to find? It doesn't make sense for other animals to be making some of the tree structures, and bears and stuff really don't nest like that, like put together nests. They more are in dens and caves and things like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting topic, and I obviously hear a lot about it. I think there's a little bit of maybe a truth, and then a lot of untruth, we'll call it. I think, unfortunately, the topic of Sasquatch gets a lot of information that nobody can really point to where it came from. That sort of becomes the norm. It sort of becomes accepted as evidence. I think a lot of these tree structures are that, and I see a lot of times online people posting alleged tree structures that, I can clearly tell are bushcraft shelters or kids having fun. Things that I used to do. I used to do survival training, and we used to build debris shelters and lean-tos and teepee-like structures, and just kind of, they sit there for a few years in the woods. They kind of rot a little bit, and it seems like, oh well, nobody would use this for shelter. And I see a lot of people posting this. I think that just kind of comes with our general societal sort of inferiority in the woods nowadays. The vast majority of people don't spend a lot of time in the woods, so the moment they see something unusual, it's immediately has to be a Bigfoot. I think Bigfoot on the brain, that sort of thing. And I just think that's just the way we've been conditioned, right? People just don't spend as much time in the woods. 100, 150 years ago, in general, society lived so much closer to the land in terms of, our food and everything. We were very, very much more self-sufficient than we are nowadays. So I think people just don't know a lot about the woods. I'm not claiming to be an expert, just sort of my observed experiences from being out there, seeing this sort of stuff, and knowing the kind of structures that I used to build, that I think make people leave them, especially in populated areas of state parks where there's kids and other people going in there and practicing their bushcrafting skills, and then somebody comes along with maybe a Bigfoot enthusiast and says, "Oh my God, why would somebody ever build this?" Well, there's a lot of reasons why they might. That being said, though, there are structures and things that I've seen that are very interesting and frankly compelling. Tree twists and bends that are very unusual. You do have the phenomenon of bears that can climb into like a smaller tree or a sapling, and that bends it over into what maybe looks like something bent it over. But you see those kinds of things twisted around each other or twisted into other trees. And once you are able to get rid of, through process elimination, stuff like snow load, weather damage. Let's say you have a whole grove of trees that's knocked over. There's a chance that was probably some sort of weather damage, but you have one tree that's twisted into itself almost like a pretzel among other trees that are completely unharmed. That's a little weird. I don't know what that would be. And I think more compelling than the tree bend stuff, which, there's plenty of, and I think most of it is just natural occurrence. It's not Sasquatch related. There are supposedly a certain kind of nests that have been found, and I've been lucky enough to go to a spot in the Olympic Peninsula again, which fantastic area, where a group called the Olympic Project has discovered these very unusual nests, these sort of ground nests that, there's been a lot of controversy about them, and whether or not they're Sasquatch related, it's hard to say. There's testing going on, and just the area it's in is extremely remote for somebody to be going out there and building these sorts of things, and none of the other wildlife in the area is known to do that. Even eagles, which supposedly will make ground nests in certain situations. They make these elaborate nests up in trees, but these areas that we went into were so thick, I would find it extremely hard to believe an eagle would be able to go in there and dig into an area like that with that much cover in the way. As a bird, they're not exactly the most nimble on the ground and that sort of thing. So these nests are very, very interesting, and there were multiple nests found, and they were kind of lined up on a ravine that went down into a creek that has a salmon run every year or so. So there's great food sources. One of these nests was kind of right on the edge of this sort of ravine, and there were even rocks found near it that had score marks on them. Two rocks almost that looked like they had been clacked together. And that was a very interesting, to me, pretty compelling. I mean, I can't say it was Sasquatch related or not, but very unusual, deduce people being responsible for it or other wildlife. That just doesn't make sense. You'd see more of repeated behavior, perhaps. If it was something else, something more common. But that area has a long history of Bigfoot sightings and very remote. It just so happened to be that a surveyor came across these sort of alleged nests and was completely caught by surprise as somebody that had spent so much time in the woods their entire career in that area in the Pacific Northwest and had never seen anything like this, and reached out to one of these Bigfoot research groups, in this case the Olympic Project, and kind of studying, and they found footprints and even handprints near some of these nests. So yeah, that's a really interesting one. So like I said, I think when it comes to the supposed tree structures, I think unfortunately most of it is not Sasquatch related. I think it's a lot of wishful thinking and a lot of misidentification, but there are those rare few that are worth looking at, that you can't say are Sasquatch related, but you can look at and say, well, I mean, this is something you should look out for. This kind of, is this pattern repeatable? Can we find anywhere else where there's anything similar to this? That I think is worth looking into.
Yeah. So what do you have coming up? I know y'all have had quite a few of the Small Town Monsters documentaries come out.
Well, so for the moment, Beyond the Trail is kind of what we're doing. That's obviously it's really time consuming because we spend a lot of time traveling and going to these locations, and a lot of people reach out to us and say, hey, we've got stuff going on out here. We'd love for you guys to come out. And that's basically what I'm doing mostly. I do have my show Sasquatch Out of the Shadows, and that was a live show that I started right when COVID kind of began. I know there's a lot of people doing podcasts and live streams, and I kind of decided to do one. And we talk Bigfoot and other stuff, and on a bit of a hiatus right now, but I'll probably be coming back in June or into July. But like I said, Beyond the Trail, that's our biggest sort of thing that we've got. We've got a lot that we're doing with that. Like I said, we were just up in Alaska, and we've got multiple films coming out just from our Alaska trip, and also the Small Town Monsters on the Trail of Bigfoot series, also Alaska related. We'll be in West Virginia soon. In June, actually, I'm speaking at the West Virginia Bigfoot Festival in Sutton, West Virginia. I believe the 26th of June. So we'll be in that area around that time. We'll probably be actually in Tennessee in end of July, if all things go well, at I want to say the Smoky Mountain Bigfoot Conference.
Yeah.
Tennessee Bigfoot Conference. I'm so sorry. There's a lot. There's like multiple ones in Tennessee. I know we'll be at one of those, so we'll probably be hanging out in Tennessee at some point, which I'm really excited for because I haven't been to Tennessee in quite a few years, and we were just in North Georgia back in February, and it's similar, but the Smoky Mountains in that area, I've backpacked there in the past, and I absolutely love it. And in some ways, it reminds me of up here in New Hampshire, the Appalachians, but it's got that southern twist to it, so it's pretty unique. So I'm excited for that. But in terms of Beyond the Trail, we've got tons of episodes coming up. Just all these, like I said, it's so time consuming because we're always on the road. We spend a week or two almost every month at this point out somewhere in some part of North America. And Alaska was obviously a really big trip because it's just so dang far away. So, we spent almost 3 weeks up there, and we had a lot of pretty interesting stuff happening. And we're just excited to share some of our findings. We found some pretty interesting stuff, and we're talking to some folks behind the scenes about analyzing certain pieces of alleged evidence and audio, because we like to we treat the subject, I think, with the respect it deserves, and we try to take it as seriously as we can. I mean, we have fun out in the field. You'll see in some of our episodes we goof off and we do silly stuff, but that's just who hasn't gone on a camping? When you go on camping trips or research trips, it's you got to have some laughs along the way. That's the reality of it. We're not serious 100% of the time, but we're very serious about this topic and keeping it real and not embellishing or anything like that. We have no need to do that. And if we do get alleged evidence, like I said, we let our audiences know, but, and more importantly, we talk to the right people behind the scenes that can have a sort of unbiased perspective and say, hey, can you listen to this audio, or can you run this through some of your academic people, your scientists, your biologists? What could this be? We want their opinions. We don't want to just go to, people that are our friends that are obviously going to probably, hey, you're my friend, so yes, I like your evidence. We don't want that. We want somebody with an unbiased perspective that can sort of lend some of their expertise and credibility to maybe help us figure out, is this something or is it nothing? We've had times in the past where mysterious hair samples have come up as raccoon, or other things that are explainable. And we like to be able to say, well, hey, pump the brakes here, guys. Not everything you experience in the woods is Bigfoot related. Let's keep it, let's try to stay grounded. I think that's really important. This topic sadly has a lot of, Bigfoot on the brain and just a lot of BS entertainment out there that, wants to tell you everything's Bigfoot. I just don't think that's the case. And that's not the way I see it. And, we call it like we see it, and that's sort of our approach. And, but with that said, we do have, like I said, a lot of content, a lot of episodes coming up, and hopefully people will enjoy it. If not for the Sasquatch, for the journey and some of these amazing natural areas we get to be, blessed, absolutely blessed to go into and are invited into. And, we try to showcase those environments as best we can, and, just kind of take people along for the ride, especially with how crazy the world is nowadays. I think it's a good escape in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Yeah. And kind of, enticing people to get back out in the wilderness and go look for these things, whether you ever find anything or not. Sometimes it's more about the journey than it is about, what you find.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Sometimes it's more about the journey. Sometimes it's more about what you find, but hey, as long as you're having fun along the way. And, like I said, I love being able to take people along, and I hear people send me emails and I get messages and comments, people that aren't able to get out there that, they kind of live vicariously through us. And it means a lot to them having an impact on people in the sense that they're able to enjoy what we do, and they kind of feel like they're part of it. And we love hearing back from them, and, whether they like it or not, obviously they can let us know, but, it's been a lot of fun, and I really enjoy doing the Beyond the Trail stuff, and we definitely don't have any plans to slow it down anytime soon. So we're going full speed ahead.
And Beyond the Trail is available on YouTube under the Small Town Monsters YouTube. And then you have Sasquatch Out of the Shadows. That's your own channel there.
Yep.
And people can go to petakovmedia.com, and all the links are there. But I'll also put all the links in the show notes for everybody. And you're on social media.
Yes, yeah. And Petakov Media is the best place. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, all that sort of stuff. And I post a lot of other stuff on there too, pictures and some of the behind the scenes stuff, and just the beautiful locations and all that sort of stuff. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, definitely check it out.
All right, Alexander, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with us today. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure, and can't wait to get to Tennessee myself.
All right, everybody, stay safe out there. Have a good day. We'll see you next time. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening.
You have come to the end of the line.